Okay, officially welcome everyone. This is our third in our series of theatre industry masterclass conversations, and our last one was about directing, as most of you know. Tonight we're going to discuss musical direction. Just a couple of housekeeping bits. Please keep your mics off until the Q&A at the end. Feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat box as we go. We can answer them at the end of the session. So tonight we are very honoured to have Mr. Torquil Munro with us. Torquil Munro has been musical director on many productions in London's West End, the USA and Asia, and was part of the original team to set up the smash hit Mamma Mia. I am under strict instructions to not get it wrong, right, Torquil?
It's probably going to be easy to get it wrong if you've pulled it from the internet.
That's true. Well, I pulled it from the internet and my deep knowledge of what a genius you are. You're also a composer. He's recently been, or is currently, a guest conductor also for the following. We've got Dear Evan Hansen, Pretty Woman, Tina Turner. He's basically worked on pretty much everything. Is there anything that you would add to that, Torquil?
Well, I guess initially, yes. I mean, these days I am a freelance MD. I don't tend to be on the same production every night. That's my choice, but I have been in that position. So that's something we'll probably talk about.
Yeah, we'd love to hear both perspectives on that, to be honest. And then also we've got Josh this evening as well. So Josh regularly works as a conductor, performer and composer, and formerly has worked as music director across a range of productions, including RicNic Staffordshires productions of Fame, High School Musical, productions of We Will Rock You, Neil Gwynn, and several digital cabaret productions throughout the pandemic. So Josh is going to interview you tonight, Torquil, if that's okay, because I felt that he was a lot more in the know on the musical direction side of things than me.
Absolutely fine by me.
Fantastic. Let's kick off then, shall we?
Yeah, right. Interview always seems like a scary word, but we'll just we'll just go through and take into account. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm just out of interest, I'm just going to stick a poll up to kind of see who does what, kind of who we've got here. So that should pop up and be visible now in terms of who's a performer, directors, choreographers, MDs, that sort of thing, just so we can kind of aim this at who we've got so far. So,
now, shall I take part as well?
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so lots of performers, 4 out of 6 MDs. That's not bad. That's good. That's not bad. So we know kind of cool. So we'll go through some of the basics, some of the more detailed bits in terms of breaking the role down and stuff. So I guess let's start with the big one of what is music direction.
Music direction is anything to do with music, anything and all to do with music. I think we hear all these terms: music supervisor, music assistant, everything else. I think a lot of those roles are new. Music director traditionally has always been in charge of the music. So that's preparing scores, that's often orchestrating, rehearsing, conducting, everything to do with music. And then together with the other creatives, then it becomes a creative role in the sense of being a storyteller, being part of that team to bring the story to life, but on the music side, obviously.
Yeah, great. And I think that touched on one of my later questions of kind of all these different roles that go down, break down and go into it, and how those work together. Do you find in profession it's different in kind of working on big West End shows as opposed to maybe smaller stuff early in the career, that you have different numbers of people in the music team?
Yeah, absolutely. The bigger the production, the more money involved potentially, the more people and the more music by committee it can become. But yeah, they're usually smaller scale means less personnel, and actually I've always found that more rewarding myself. But it's always nice to be involved in a big show.
Absolutely. And just on kind of a personal preference, do you find you prefer to go into something kind of when it's fairly new, when you're still kind of going through those workshop stages, or do you prefer to go in when it's kind of set and you just teach the music and go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always nice to be able to have a hand in setting up, but that's not always possible. And often my roles these days are going in on existing productions, learning, and then being involved once it's set up. So not so much a creative role. But yeah, I think it is preferable to be involved in the beginning and be able to make those creative decisions that you wouldn't normally do if you were coming on later.
Right. I think I'm just going to pick up on some questions as we go through, because I see Byron's put one in. Byron said, "Do you think music by committee is a good or a bad thing, or just general thoughts? I always remember a conductor telling me orchestra is not a democracy, but of course it's more nuanced than that."
Yeah, I mean, I think committee. When I say committee, it's more a creative committee or production committee. The orchestra, much as we obviously want to hear from the orchestra is there to play. Hey, we'll chat, we'll listen, but yeah, they won't be involved necessarily in the creative decisions in the nitty gritty. So yes, committee, I think, is producers and sometimes people that aren't so musical.
How do you deal with those situations when you're talking music with people who aren't necessarily musical or musically trained, for instance?
Well, I think that's comes down to a whole. That is a huge part of musical theatre. I mean, I started in youth theatre, dealing with young people who aren't necessarily musicians. Yeah. I have to say, it's not much different. Often dealing with adults. Obviously, there are different levels of musical ability, but it's the same as hill walking. You have to go as slow as the slowest member. I don't want to use the word slow, but I hope you know what I mean. Forgive me for using that word. But yeah, we have to cater for all abilities and therefore be as clear and big and all-encompassing as possible, which you would do, which I always did as with youth theatre, with children. Yeah, you still have to do it with adults because the skill set is always at different levels, musically speaking.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
And yeah, I think that really interesting stuff to kind of hear how the different roles interact. I know when we look at it, it's part of the reason why we kind of ask for different production team members to be here as part of this sort of session, because for those of you kind of doing your productions, it's really useful to see how those roles interact and how you can support or get out of the way of the MD and other roles similarly. So I think you touched a bit then on kind of how you started, but so how did you kind of get started, and what's your career progression look like up to now?
Well, yeah, as I say, I started with actually the National Youth Music Theatre, which you probably heard of. I was brought up in Edinburgh, so while I was at school, one of my teachers, the head of music, a new head of music had arrived from England because I'm from Scotland. He had come from the school where Jeremy James Taylor and others had set up the National Youth Music Theatre in the first place. And in those days, they always took shows up to the Edinburgh Festival. So they got in touch with my head of music and said, is there anyone that can act as a assistant musical director, someone that plays the piano, etc. And that was what I was doing at the time. And I'd had an early introduction to musical theatre because when I had passed my grade 8 at age 13, my mum said, if you get a distinction, I'm going to take you to see Cats in London. Now, I think that was mainly because she wanted to see it, but she took me along, and I thought, that's pretty good. Yeah. So I become interested that at that age, and then when I was about 14, 15 was when the National Youth Music Theatre thing came along. So yeah, immediately was thrust into, I would say, very much nearly professional quality shows, as the NYMT really did great stuff in those days, and they still do. So yes, that was my first introduction. I continued to learn classical piano, and I decided to study in London at the Royal Academy of Music. But while I was there, I was still doing, I was doing lots of things. I've never been one to stick to one thing. I was doing house music for Belgian clubs whilst I was supposed to be practicing Rachmaninoff. And I was doing shows at drama schools. I worked at RADA while I was at college, RADA, Central School of Speech and Drama, and various places in London. And then forged relationships with various teachers and visiting professionals there, which is how I then began to build up and get jobs in the real world. So my first real touring show was Cats, because I'd met Nick Davis, who at the time was an MD for Cameron Mackintosh. He was doing Les Mis, and he said to me after he came to see a show at Central that I was MDing, would you like to come and meet Martin Koch, who was music supervisor for Cameron at the time? And I said, well, that would be lovely. And he said, well, he's interviewing for MDs of Les Mis. And I said, okay, does he know that I'm not going to be MD of Les Mis? And he said, oh, yes, absolutely. It's just to be able to meet him. There might be other opportunities, but I think it would be great if you met him. So a couple of days later, I found myself at Cameron's office and met Martin Koch, walked into the room. The first thing he said was, why do you want to be MD of Les Mis? And I said, well, there's a funny thing. I didn't think we were going to be talking about that, but I'd love to be. And he said, it's okay, don't worry. But we're looking for an assistant on Cats. So, that's how it then started, the ball rolling, and kind of grew from there, from Cats. Within Cameron's, my next show was Miss Saigon in Drury Lane, which was a rather lovely thing to be thrust into.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Quite the track record, and quite the kind of sudden thrown in the deep end almost.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think I think we perhaps all know the best way to learn is to be doing it. I did when I was at the academy. There was no musical theatre courses. There were no MD courses anywhere. I had never studied in that sense. As far as theatre went, it was all learning on the job, as it were. But of course, we do have all these fabulous courses now, which really prepare people for the industry, perhaps better than I was prepared.
That was going to be one of my questions. Do you find you wish those courses had existed in terms of focusing just on MDing? Do you think it's more beneficial to kind of do a bit of everything and have that translate across?
I'd like to think that I was pretty rounded because I was training classically, I was doing pop music, I was doing all sorts. And therefore, when it comes to musical theatre, you're going to have to deal with every style, unless you're concentrating on one genre of shows. But I think certainly those courses are very much all-encompassing when it comes to genre. So I think there's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. But yes, I often think when I meet people that are doing the courses, you know more about something than I do still, because I didn't go through that training, So I learn from people when I go into work at colleges as well.
Excellent. So I think if we're kind of, I think if we talk more generally about kind of, we'll come on to the freelance aspect later on, but I think if you're going into kind of a production on the whole, as you are the MD, what's your kind of process? So producer kind of books you as MD. What's your process in terms of research, preparation through to kind of day one of rehearsals?
Obviously, I think it's different for every project, but in a very general sense, we'd start with early production meetings to discuss personnel, size of production, therefore size of cast, size of band, and then we'd have to with those parameters in mind, work out what the orchestration is, whether it needs reorchestration or if we're dealing with an existing orchestration, and obviously if we're dealing with existing vocal arrangements. So those are the early production meetings. Then from that, going to scheduling for rehearsals, working out a timeline. probably the theatre's been booked and the tickets are being sold anyway. That's nothing to do with me, but we're working toward that timeline. Hopefully I can get an assistant as well to help me, because that's always nice, because you have to be in 2 or if not 3 rooms at once when it comes to rehearsals. So we yes, working to a timeline for rehearsal, and dealing with any orchestration or any other things that might have to be done during that time. And that's when, yes, we need 14 hands.
And do you find on kind of the bigger shows that you're still having to have some of these conversations at I know often smaller shows have these conversations of, we need to reduce the band, can you get away with a keyboard instead of a string section? Do they tend to happen on kind of the bigger scale as well?
No, I think, well, I mean, it can do, but hopefully things are set more. Well, the biggest problem we have, not problem, but an issue between shows that are coming from America to London is, of course, the band sizes are pretty much usually going to be different. They're going to be smaller in London because of the theatre rule on Broadway, where they have to employ a certain amount of musicians. Similarly, when a show goes from London to New York, that band might have to be expanded. In fact, almost always has to be expanded to be able to fit in with the union rules on Broadway. That's usually when those sort of things will happen, and depends how deep-pocketed the producer might be on a show in Britain. Touring shows, that's when things start to get smaller, obviously, and need to be reorchestrated with a meat cleaver sometimes.
It's reassuring to know that it's kind of, that at least there's some sort of security in terms of keeping musical quality at the forefront and things as it gets big, as it gets kind of higher up levels. So that
you would hope so. One of my favorite terms is always, do we remember it's called a musical?
Yeah.
And that comes to talking to lots of different departments. It's not a dancicle. It's not an acticle, but of course, we all work together.
Yeah.
But sometimes the music is the thing that gets forgotten.
Yeah. I used to never understand why producers were trying to kind of cut costs or work, or why they couldn't kind of focus on the band, until it came to fairly recently when I've had to kind of try and budget for a band as well as a cast and everything. And at that point, you kind of realize that actually, at what point, obviously, there's times where you go, I'd love to have a live band, but it's just not going to happen in this case, unfortunately. But obviously, as we get closer and closer to professional, obviously that becomes more of a priority. So, right. So yeah, so we've kind of, it's really interesting to hear that pre-production stage. And what preparation do you expect the cast to have done before they enter the rehearsal room?
I think depending on the length of rehearsals, often we might pre-prepare recorded tracks for learning harmonies, etc., to try and cut down all the note bashing in the room. But I have to say that's one of my favorite parts of it. That's how you get to know people. You know, you in the rehearsal stage, and we're all learning it together. That's a big thing. Whereas if people come in with different, at different levels, again, it's like I'll keep saying it's like a hill walking, hiking analogy. If you've got different people at different levels, it can be a bit counterproductive in the room. So all learning together is my favorite, but if there are time constraints, often we'll put together tracks for the cast to practice with prior to rehearsals.
And could you talk a bit on kind of what sort of techniques you use to actually teach the music, how that process goes as well?
Sure, yeah. I mean, again, I'll go back to working with children, how you have to be as clear and as take the time to be as clear and detailed as you can, because the initial learning is, and that's often the only time that you get on the music, because everyone's then suddenly thrust into dancing and thinking of lots of other things, and if that isn't drilled, it can be counterproductive, definitely. So again, it's different on every project, but I would be, as we all know, we go through every single harmony line, we go through every single actually I'm just thinking about ensemble work as opposed to principals, of course. What will often happen is that the ensemble will learn first, so that then they can go off and dance and keep practicing that, because they'll probably be doing more movement, etc. And then working with principals is usually comes at that time rather than the other way around, unless there's another pre-production week. Sometimes happens where you can have time with principals before putting it together. But again, it's different every time, and depending on the amount of time you have.
No, that's great. What I might do is I'm just going to launch that. I realised I never actually shared the results from the first poll in terms of kind of who's in which role. So we've got kind of, out of 8, we've got 5 performers, 5 MDs, a couple of kind of producers, tech teams, directors. What I was just going to go on to is to share another poll about kind of, because I'm interested to know for the performers here of whether you prefer to learn. Do you prefer to learn from the script, from the libretto? Do you prefer to learn from the sheet music? Can you read sheet music? Because this is one of the questions I was going to go on to, of which do you teach from, or which would you like to teach from in an ideal world, and which do you find you actually teach from in reality?
That's a good point. And the iPhone is a wonderful, wonderful invention. I don't know if anyone's heard of a dictaphone these days, but they used to run out of batteries all the time.
I think based on the responses, we're on 3/4 from the score, but then we've got a lot of MDs in the room, so maybe that skews it. I don't know, but
yeah. Again, it's all about the hill walking analogy.
Yeah.
Some people read music, some people don't.
Do you find, because if you don't mind me asking, for those who don't read sheet music, do you find that when a show is up on its feet, that those people, because they never learnt from the music, they learnt audibly, that they can tend to find it easier to go onto their feet? Or do you think that is it usually the other way around, that actually those that read sheet music are stronger from the outset?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think probably the people that don't read will then do more homework potentially, which will then, it'll become muscle memory quicker.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
But again, I think everyone's different, and it's keeping an eye on who is struggling and who is doing, who's doing well. But yeah, I think potentially there is that muscle memory can happen more for the people that drill it by ear.
Yeah, and have the recordings of absolutely everything. I think having the sheet music and the recordings, you've got to have both, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that leads quite nicely on to kind of one of my next questions. Of once the show is kind of up on its feet and people are off scores, what sort of thing are you looking for in the rehearsals to give notes on, and how do you go about giving those notes kind of in a supportive way?
So we're always supportive. There isn't any other way of doing it, is there? But yeah, we don't. Vocal calls are precious. They won't happen very often. Of course, we do have probably more understudy rehearsal and cover rehearsal, which is continuing with learning, and swings as well, of course, have to learn all the vocal tracks. So that's a constant upkeep. But yeah, warm-ups before the show. If there are particular problems, if we're doing a show every night, that's the time before the half when we've done a warm-up, to just, if there are particular things that can be fixed at that point. And as long as it's nothing that will embarrass someone in front of the entire company, if there is something that may be a little more sensitive, we'll go and see them on their own.
Like, I know we talked in the last session quite a lot about kind of approaches to give notes and things, so I'm not going to spend too long on that, but that's really useful to kind of understand that. And do you I suppose at different levels, do you expect kind of professional and kind of semi-professional amateur? When do you expect cast to come in warmed up themselves? When do you do a kind of group warm up? Does that differ at all?
I don't think it differs in my experience. You know, we treat I've always treated every company, whether it's a youth theatre company and everything, I say we're doing this like a professional show. It is a professional show. So yes, you do have responsibility to warm yourself up, but we do provide warm-ups as well. Actually, funnily enough, in the West End, a lot of the time, companies think they want to have voluntary warm-ups rather than compulsory warm-ups.
Bad idea.
I know, but it's often a thing. And yes, some people have great warm-ups and that they'll do in the room, but I think it's an important element of being a company that you have to be together doing those warm-ups. It's often the only time you'll be all together just to be able to touch base, and it's an important thing mentally as well as vocally.
And that leads on quite nicely. It's kind of how do you ensure that company well-being within your work and that kind of that whole company feel in keeping that positive energy going?
I think don't bombard with notes. Going back to that, and yeah, you've got to read the room and judge how we're all doing. Well-being physically and vocally is something that's obviously extremely important to the MD. And what I think is important to remember is the MD is not a singing teacher, and that's what the company need to know as well. They will often have their own singing teachers, and I will often work with their singing teachers because I am not going to pretend that I am a vocal practitioner. That's not my job. And obviously everyone has different singing teachers and different techniques. So I don't want to mess with that. But if there's something that we're not achieving, that I'm not achieving with the performer, I want to go to the singing teacher with them and try and work out what it is we're trying to achieve. So that's vocal well-being for me. That's how I think of that. And mental health, obviously, paramount for all the creatives. And again, checking in with everyone. And I think that important company time is the time where we can just keep a check on everything and smile.
Hmm. Yeah, have you ever had to step in on vocal health? Sorry, just a quick question. Have you ever sort of noticed, you know, that vocal health is in jeopardy and you've had to sort of say something or make a decision, or is that an MD's executive decision, or is that the actor's executive decision in your experience? Can it be a mix of both?
If it applies to other creatives, say dance department, etc., if there are problems with singing whilst doing a lot of movement, those are things that have to be worked out. But if it's just purely vocal health, I think you're meaning, it can often be because someone doesn't have a singing teacher, and sometimes performers can forget that they are athlete. They have to be athletes, and they're always training, and they have to work with a trainer in that sense. So if someone is not looking after themselves, we might suggest ways of dealing with it better. It's yes, but it can be you've got to be sensitive to what's happening there. But yeah, I think it would only be about my relationship with the performer and the singing teacher. I think if it's just a purely a vocal question that we're dealing with.
Thank you.
Yeah, really interesting approaches and kind of understanding the dynamics of what goes into it. So how do you ensure your own well-being within your work as well then?
Eat properly, sleep, and not get too wound up about everything. But yeah, it can be a relentless. We're on call the whole time. You know, that's the thing. As an MD, particularly, you know, if you're doing your own show, it's important to get away from it, whilst still being extremely present for the company and the production. And that is it's a tricksy position to be in often, because there's one day off a week, and we are, as I say, on call all the time. But yes,
Actors are needy.
Actors can be needy. Hannah, I don't know. Yes, no, I do. Yeah. I think it's the same as any job which has unsociable hours. But it is important to keep perspective, whilst, you know, being completely committed to that show is the important thing. But yeah, you've got to remember your own health and life.
Yeah, there's really important stuff, and I think that goes across the board in terms of not just specific to this role, but specific to any of these sorts of things. I was reading an interesting thread the other day of kind of out of kind of director, choreographer, that sort of thing. Those guys can always do the show, set it, and then it doesn't matter if they have a night off or whatever. Whereas the MD's there every night driving the show. Yeah. And
it's a sort of it's a strange role in that sense that we are creative, but we're running the show, and it's a very odd. I think it does lend itself to potentially more health damage, because of those hours, and you're performing every night. Yes, everyone else is performing as well, but often we're doing all the rehearsals as well, and companies, the performers actually have more rules in place as to how much time they spend rehearsing and then performing, whereas not so much for the conductor of the show, whether that's the MD or the supervisor or the, you know.
Do you find it's hard to keep kind of come at it fresh when you, especially on a longer run? Do you find it's hard to keep that energy up across the band as well?
Yeah,
but also
of course it can be. Yeah, I've always had a trick. It's not a terribly clever trick, but it's, you know, the conductor's position, if it's a traditional podium or at the pit rail, look at that front row, look at the audience, and remember that they're there for the first time, and we're with them, and we are delivering it for them for the first time, and we have to feel that way every time. That's the only way that I can think about it. Yeah. Even after I did a couple of shows for 4 years.
Yeah, that's. I look at some of kind of the Phantom orchestras who did kind of 35 years or whatever it was, and I'm like, I don't know how you could do it and keep it fresh and not kind of fall behind. But that's useful to kind of know that perspective, actually know that way of looking at it.
But also within that, I think it's healthy when you know your time is when you should stop doing that particular production. If it is a long-running show like that, it's detrimental to the production for you to continue. if you feel you cannot be fresh.
Very true. That's a nice kind of segue actually onto band. So how do you approach kind of rehearsing and conducting the band, and how do you approach a sitz probe or a band call as well?
Okay. Well, you don't get much time with the band. You don't get to rehearse the band very much on a big show. The Musicians Union is one of the strongest unions, so the clock is ticking every time. But hopefully we are able to do enough. Sitz probe, that's the most fun day, isn't it? Where everyone gets to meet, and it's still very fresh for everyone.
The best day.
The best day. And that's when we get to show off, because that's the only time they'll watch us doing what we do. Band-wise. Hopefully they'll be watching the conductor if when we're doing the show. But yeah, so obviously the sitz probe is a natural progression from all the rehearsal that we've already done. Hopefully the cast is all set and ready, and we know what we're doing. The band we'll have done some band calls, depending again on amount of time allowed. But hopefully we are prepared, and it's the best day. Yes.
I'm gonna launch, I think, the final poll because I'm interested to hit. This one's for the MDs. I'm interested to see, do you prefer to stick conduct? Do you prefer to conduct from piano or from another instrument? I don't know if it gives you the option to select multiple. No, it doesn't. But whichever your kind of favourite one is, I think. 3 out of 3 for stick conduct so far.
Although I have to admit it must change per show. For instance, last year with SpongeBob, I wanted to stick conduct, couldn't necessarily. And this year with High School Musical, I don't really want to stick conduct. So, yeah.
Yeah, we don't often get the choice, obviously, even when it should be a stick conduct. Economics means that it's often not. But yeah, High School Musical, you don't want to be conducting in 4 all the time, do you? And just listening to the drums. Much more fun to play along.
So what sort of techniques do you find you use when you are conducting from keys in terms of, and giving signals and vamps and stuff like that?
You have to have a good strong neck to be able to keep nodding. Big nods, and the most important thing is to be able to nod in time with your playing. You'd be amazed how many people can't. So yeah, it's working out how much you can give when you're stuck behind the keyboard. On most shows these days, there's a camera, so you don't have to be as big as perhaps you would necessarily be with a stick conduct. Although that comes with its own problems, because technology, even though it's come on leaps and bounds, we still have delays on the monitors, as I'm sure we all know. So I actually conduct faster. I conduct ahead of the beat a lot of the time on a lot of my shows, when I know everyone is watching on the monitor, and that can get a little strange with the head, but I've been doing it long enough now, it sort of comes naturally. But hopefully I don't do that when I don't need to do that.
I'm assuming then when you've got kind of screens, you prefer the band looking up at kind of a screen on the balcony or whatever, as opposed to looking down at you if you're visible from the pit.
Well, we usually have screens on the music stands, little monitors on the music stands.
So yeah, I was meaning for cast as well.
Sorry, yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's unavoidable. I mean, I guess half my actually, I'm going to say more than half the shows are what we call remote from the pit. So these days, I'm thinking of one in Tina. On the Tina show, there's a section where I have to conduct so far ahead for the cast that the band are often going, "What are you doing?" I said, "Does it sound in time?" "Yeah, it does," because they've got to click, whereas the cast don't. So That's just one example, but it's one part of that show that I really do have to go quite ahead of the beat. I'm trying to think. Yeah, Lion King's the only one at the moment where people can actually see me. You can see me a little bit on Pretty Woman, but for some reason we're just there under. I've never quite worked out why there's this little hole in the stage where because we don't really need to be there, because it would all work on camera. But yeah, that is. And Dear Evan Hansen was all basically on camera, even though we were on stage. You weren't getting people to look behind them.
Byron's asking, what's your opinion on Click?
My opinion on Click, it's necessary sometimes. It's as long as it's not for the wrong reasons, as long as it's not just for having extra vocals and instruments. But, you know, economics again does come into play, but that doesn't occur too much on the shows that I do these days. But it also is something that means that we don't have arguments with other departments, even though you'd be amazed at how many times performers can say, that was a bit faster tonight, wasn't it? Well, no. But it depends. I can make it look as though it's going faster. Maybe that's what I was doing. I don't know. But
how many coffees did you have, Audrey?
Yeah, exactly. So it's it can feel different, even though it's the same speed. But yeah, Click. It's a necessity a lot of the time because of remote pits as well, and pop shows need to have set tempos that we again don't have arguments. And much as we're the genre of the music, pop will always be a metronome, a click going. So an internal click for the band is not necessarily a bad thing at all.
Just out of interest, how often do you decide to take the bait when you have an actor saying completely bizarre things, and how often do you kind of nod, smile and walk away knowing that that you know bit better?
Yeah, and it's reading the situation. I hope I have a relationship with performers where they know me well enough where we can have a giggle about it. But yeah, if it becomes a thing where they keep saying it, then I might just nod my head and go, I'll do better.
I guess that's fairly reassuring, at least, because I know the classic line with Click tends to be that kind of it ends up robotic and you lose the feel. But if people are thinking it's different tempos, then there must be enough flexibility within that. Then in that case, yeah. I will say that. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it gets a little bit deep and niche, but every rhythm section is going to play on the click differently. Every drummer is going to play either slightly behind, slightly ahead, and it can make it feel like a different speed, whereas the click's still the same tempo. So yes, we can have drum depths where it feels more relaxed or it's pushing more. But so we often say that to the performers if they have an issue as well. Oh, it's a drum depth. And have a word with them. All we have to remember is there weren't any refunds at the box office.
Absolutely.
I know that as much as kind of there's times I love and there's times I hate Click, but talk back is the one thing that I find really useful in terms of being able, and it's one of those things where having done shows with it, you don't realize how much you appreciate it until you try to do a show without, and you can't just kind of shout bar numbers or have a general chat through the show or that sort of thing. Is that something that kind of you find working into your workflow is kind of a crucial aspect?
Giving a standby, making sure people are awake on a longer running show and ready to start the next number because they might not be looking up. That's a big thing. Yeah, it depends on how the show is set up. There might be more cues given within numbers. Tina, for example, we have bass and drums are often going on and off stage, becoming part of scenes. And so we need to just basically keep them aware of cues and things that are coming up, because they're thinking of so many things. We're actually talking what feels an unnecessary amount during the show, to be able to keep everyone in the same aware of where we are in the numbers. But on other shows, I don't have a talk back at all. It just depends.
And I should say, for those of you kind of on the call who aren't necessarily MDs or want to look at different options and stuff, or for those watching the recording who aren't, but if the end of the production team handbook, and anybody who's kind of coming in externally, I'll send this out on the email afterwards. There's a playlist on there that has I think it's about 50 clips in the end of kind of pit cams from YouTube of the MDs, and often you've got the in-ear tracks coming through along with the band, so you can hear the click, you can hear the talk back, kind of the conversation, but everything the MD's saying, the click voice, all of these things, and see how they're conducting it, how they're playing piano as well, and conducting with the head. There's quite a few on there. There's some really good kind of Hairspray, Motown, that sort of thing in terms of your more contemporary shows. And then there's a few good ones on there that I've put on there from things like Phantom of the Opera and kind of the more stick conducting shows. So if you're wanting to kind of see more of this side of it, whether you're just interested or whether it's kind of almost learning and teaching yourself, that's a really useful resource I found. That I learned to MD off those, in a lot of it, and that did me well for several shows until I was able to kind of get the more formal training. So it's a good way to kind of look at a range and help to find your conducting style as well, I'd say.
Right.
Yeah, and we touched a bit on it before, kind of. So when you're going in freelance into these shows now, do you, obviously if it's a show you've done before, you'll kind of have those memories of, I need to be this far ahead, or these bits are tricky. How do you approach going into a show that you haven't worked on before, though, or going in to one you haven't done for a while?
Yeah, well, so you mean after the initial learning stage?
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, kind of a bit after, and then, or a bit if you ask to
the show that's on my, so being depping on a new one. I mean, obviously you're going to learn the same as if you were a keyboard dep or a MD, hover MD. You're going to spend a lot of time learning. You're going to be observing. You're going to be soaking it all up. But it is, yes, it's definitely, unless you're involved in say a cast change rehearsal, that's always the best way to learn a show, because you're actually learning again with other people that are going into the show. But we don't often have that luxury. The timing doesn't often work that way. So say, for example, I was conducting a show that I haven't done for a month or so. On the day, I'll just refresh myself. There's again, it's depending on how complex that show is. Hannah, the last one I did with Hannah, that was complex. So there was actually a setup in the dressing room. That was Dear Evan Hansen, because we had such the complex Ableton setup with the computer and a foot pedal to start and stop clicks, which is not how any of my other shows run. So it was something I really had to try and get into my body. And I'm not going to talk about the final, was it my penultimate show, where I managed to misfire a click. But that's fine. It's fine.
Better than my penultimate show where I knocked over a bottle of wine. So
yeah. But then there is a question on that. This is nothing to do with the question, and I shouldn't go on to it, but it's a bit of a tangent. But we are in talks because the MD is having to run so many aspects of the production when it comes to those kind of setups. It's lights, it's projections, it's sound cues, it's all sorts that are suddenly on our shoulders that we have to be able to trigger when I first learned Dear Evan Hansen, there was, I'll say again, I had a little problem with one number where I misfired a click, and I was told, "Oh, it's okay. The LX operator managed to do it manually." Well, that's nice of him? Maybe they could do that every time. No,
Could they not do? Yeah.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's all about, because all those it's very much hitting beats and everything else, and of course it was cleaner that it was all fired from MIDI on the Ableton setup. But these productions are getting more and more complex. Anyway, going back to the initial
Forgive
point.
me
Yes.
for coming in very quickly on that, because my percussion teacher Deps on Frozen, percussion kit, whatever it is, and of course Frozen has got automation everywhere in it. And he showed me his score and was saying that literally the opening click is started by the MD, but
and that's the only one.
Else is on the percussion book, and he's marked out what all of his click triggers actually do. So that he understands what he's triggering. But he said it's such an onerous thing to have on him, even as a drummer, to be able to get, know that that's all he's doing. It's interesting hearing it from your perspective as well.
It's interesting that he would write what they are, because then your head is going to be thinking that, rather than it's just, I'm just going to hit this pad, I'm going to start the click. But that's very conscientious of him. Within that, there was one of my first shows that had a setup like that, was Ghost, where there was actually a moving wall at one point, which was up to us. And I never stopped the show, but another cover conductor did. It's dangerous. We're only human.
It's just madness what you're expecting.
Byron kind of touched on my question, because I was going to reference, I think Hamilton is the same with him in the percussion book, and I was going to, obviously in an ideal world it wouldn't be on the band. If it is, would you rather have it yourself as MD? Would you rather have it on the percussion figure? Hypothetically, as if we're going to say.
No, it just depends again on the setup. I guess, what have I got? Tina, I fire clicks myself. Pretty Woman, the drummer, fires them. Where are we? Frozen, as we know, the drummer does. So it's Dear Evan Hansen was scary. And I think unnecessarily so. There were enough notes to play, let's be honest. It was a challenge, and I enjoyed it. And I looked forward to conquering it every time I did it. I'll leave it at that.
And then going to the pub afterwards.
Yes.
No, that's fab. So I think it's interesting to kind of get this insight into all the specifics, because I've spent so much of the time kind of sat there watching all like these kit breakdowns and how many backups for main stage there are on all these shows, and how one button switches between them, but actually hearing the player's perspective almost is interesting to kind of understand what actually works and almost how to simplify a setup in future. That's
actually useful. Sorry, I just realized that why I was talking about Dear Evan Hansen was the nice thing about it was because they did realize that it needed a lot of keeping on top of, because there was no second keyboard on the show. There was actually an MD rig in the dressing room where we could practice. So we had to have an extra, the second conductor in the building in case anything happened. So sometimes I was booked just to be in the dressing room and be the cover in case anything happened. But that was my opportunity to run the show and just keep it in me. So
or be harassed by needy actors wanting to run their songs.
And sometimes that as well.
Yeah.
But that was a luxury, but it was justified because of the complexity of that show.
Right. Yeah, so I think we'll probably go 10 more minutes or so, and then we'll open up to a few more questions. So what would you say is the best bit of your job and the most challenging part of the job? We'll go most challenging instead of worst. I mean, we can go worst instead.
Well, it's easy. The most challenging is that when you get a show like Dear Evan Hansen. No, I'll. Right. The best part of the job is it's not a proper job. I keep telling people that you don't have to go down the mines. But the best part, I guess, I actually enjoy rehearsal more than anything, I think, and it's working with the company, because you're getting to know people and you're working through the teaching aspect. I enjoy. Obviously, performance is great, and we get applauded at the end of it. But that's the same. That's what is the more repetitive side of it. Whereas rehearsal is not repetitive, even though you're going over and over things. It doesn't feel repetitive because it's a human. We're dealing with humans, and we're dealing with what's happening. Whereas when we are performing, yes, it's a lovely, amazing thing to be able to do that performance every night. It's supposed to be the same, and so we're there to try and keep it the same, which does feel slightly counter to being a creative, is what I'll say. So actually, the challenging part is keeping it fresh. The most challenging part is keeping it fresh.
Right, really interesting stuff. And do you find that the other elements of your work, kind of as a composer and things like that, influence your work MDing, or vice versa? Do you find that kind of your conducting experience goes into your composition aspects?
I would say that, I mean, one of the reasons I'm now freelance rather than doing my own show is to be able to give myself time to write. So it'd be because you don't get the time if you are doing your job correctly as a music director on your own show. So do they cross over? Yes, I get to work with world-class musicians every day. We're actually doing a film at the moment. I'm just about to record a score to a film where I'm using some players that I have met through theatre. That's a crossover for me. I don't know that there's necessarily many more crossovers. I don't compose music theatre, so I guess I'm not useful in that sense in talking about how much my work on other shows might affect my composition. So I can say that much.
No, it's useful to understand a bit. And as has come up in this conversation before, network all the way through. That's how you get the jobs, basically. And are there specific ways you go about networking? Is it just kind of sitting down in the pub after a show? Do you intentionally set out to do it in a specific way?
I think I'm a bit old and ugly to do the networking thing. It's people I've been around long enough now that people either want me or they don't, and I get my work through word of mouth, etc. So I'm not one, because I'm not looking to do my own show necessarily, whereas people know me. Oh, Torquil will do. He'll cover on this for us, which is always a lovely thing to be asked to do. So again, I'm not necessarily the right person to talk about networking in the social media age, because I've not really done that much.
I mean, that's the stage I guess we all want to be at, though, where you've got these gigs coming in, it's not having to go out of the way to find them. So that's reassuring to know that it can happen. So I get. So is there anything that you wish you'd learned or been told earlier, and what sort of tips and tricks do you make use of that you've learned along the way?
Things I wish I'd been told earlier. It's more about piano playing than anything, that I always think of this. Obviously I learned very young, but for the piano players out there, why didn't they just tell us that you have to make the tune louder? the melody. It may seem obvious to us now, but it took me. There was a sort of a light coming on moment for me when I was about 15, 16. But piano teacher was all saying, "Make it sing," and I'm playing everything louder. And then I suddenly realized, oh, it's the melody that you want to be louder. Anyway, sorry, that's a different point. That's just piano playing. I don't know if anyone else went through that, but it feels like, couldn't they have just told me in the first place?
I didn't go through that, but I went through a phase of because I wasn't a pianist. Actually, by the time I found out about MDing and wanted to go into it, it was too late by then. And I tried to learn, and I kind of did basic grades, but I reached a point where that's why I changed to producing, because there was a point where there was no way I could compete with kind of other people, my peers, because I wasn't a piano player, and there's not enough sustainable work out there as a stick conductor itself. Like, I could bash out stuff in the rehearsal room, but I think that's the main sticking point I came across.
It's definitely become that way. Whereas I did, when I was starting out, I knew a lot of, I was assisting MDs that were string players and wind players more than pianists. It meant that I was doing more of the work, it has to be said, but when it came to the rehearsal room, when it came to warm-ups, but you're right, there was more chance then, but these days it's more about keyboard MDs, isn't it? So I'm trying to think if there's anything particularly MDE that I wish someone had told me. No, I'd have to think of that. I'd think about that for longer, I'm afraid.
That's another problem. And I think final two before we just fairly nice ones for you, open up to the Q&A. Is there a dream show that you'd love to work on?
I have always wanted to do West Side Story with full orchestra.
That's a good choice.
I mean, wouldn't we? Doesn't happen very often, and I've never been. I did do a tour once where I wasn't MD, but I was playing a clavinova in a 5-piece band for West Side Story, and I do have a little story if you'd like to hear it.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So I don't know if anyone's heard of floppy disks, but in those days,
one once.
in those days there were these little floppy. Well, they weren't floppy in the little mini ones, the square ones. This particular production was set up by. He was an MD, but he's also an organist and a very fabulous musician. Wayne, I've forgotten his name. I've forgotten his last name. Anyway, very clever man. And what he managed to do was he programmed the scene change music and all sorts, and the rumble and things on the sequencer within the clavinova. But because there wasn't enough memory, it had to be all on different discs, which I had to load at different points during the show. So we were one night coming up to the end of Act 1 in the quintet, and I'd already, yes. So the next disc was ready to play the rumble, which was a lot of drums and things. And at one point, another disc, which I'd had to rest on the music stand, fell down onto a key, which started the rumble scene change music during the quintet. Not the greatest moment, but I managed to stop it. But then it kept going. I managed to stop it again. It kept going. And this is when I realized after about the 4th time that it hit a button, which meant that whenever I pressed a certain key, it kept going. Anyway, I'd love to do West Side Story with a real orchestra. And not with a clavinova.
Joe says, I still have a clavinova with a floppy disk slot.
Oh, yeah? Wow. Excellent. I didn't know that they still existed.
It wouldn't be live theatre unless everyone had a few stories of kind of catastrophic mess ups. But yeah, I think final question just before you open out to the Q&A. So we've been asking kind of each person who comes on as part of their roles to sum up their role in 3 words. So how would you sum up MDing in 3 words?
Ooh, okay, I've got to think of this carefully. 3 words. I should have read the list of questions, shouldn't I? 3 words.
It can be 3 individual words. It doesn't need to
Yeah.
be like a 3-word sentence,
Yeah.
or more. We're flexible. We can break the rules.
Ending in 3 words would be, for me, frustrating, rewarding. This is not necessarily in the correct order. Frustrating, rewarding. Third one. Let me think on that. I'll come up with.
That's great. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. It's been really useful to kind of get an understanding of the role and some of your experiences and things. Are there any questions? And feel free to just jump in with questions. You don't necessarily need to stick them in the chat. We can just feel free to unmute and ask them as well. So Byron, we'll go with you first since yours in the chat. Byron says, how do you prep for a new job? Is it if you're asked to cover on a show that's new to you, or if you're asked to MD on a production? How do you prep your MD book for rehearsal/show?
Well, obviously, prepping an MD book for rehearsals is different to covering, as I'd be learning what the production MD is already doing. So I have to say I'm not one for a lot of sticky notes and color coding when it comes to rehearsal scores. I will color code full scores, but I think I've seen people in more recent years, they're very colorful and lots of stickers and tabs and all sorts. So yes, be as conscientious as you need to be when it comes to rehearsal scores. But as far as covering, being a cover conductor, obviously one does mark up one's own score, but our job is to be the MD who is already in place. And this, in many ways, like an understudy to a role, as much as they will bring a bit of themselves to it, we probably do less of that. We're allowed less of that. So I have
do you look out for one thing specific, or do you look out for something like entries? Do you always focus on, or something like that? Are you always considering when you look at a new book, I need to be careful about this bit, or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely, and to do with the physical, the geography of the production, i.e.,
Yep.
can they see me? Will this cue matter?
Yeah.
But yeah, those all have to be considered. So yeah, very important, absolutely.
Oh, amazing. Thank you.
Still trying to think of that third word. What did I say? Frustrating, rewarding.
So I've just been explaining what a floppy disk is.
Josh, did not need to expose me.
I mean, I've had a litter of questions, but I've been very rude and butted in and asked them all. So
I had a question.
Yep.
I was going to say, what do you think's like from like knowing MDs in the industry and stuff like that? Like, what do you think's the most undervalued skill, like before they get to where they are? Like, kind of, is it the piano playing, or is it like the vocal knowledge, or is it conducting?
Undervalued in the sense that potentially people haven't concentrated on, or I think modern shows mean piano playing. It does tend to happen that way now, and at the same time, often now there are skills that aren't required that used to be required, whether it's orchestration, because there will be an orchestrator, there will be a different supervisor, there will be a whatever a lot of the time, whereas the MD once upon a time had to be able to do everything on the fly, and probably very quickly as well. But yeah, I think piano playing, it's annoying for the non-piano players, obviously. We want to have well-rounded human beings being MDs and doing any job, but if you don't play the piano, it may be an issue. Word.
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you approach a conflict in decision making when you're in the audition process and there's a voice and you're like, that's the voice, and the director's like, that's not the
And
one.
the dance department doesn't put them
and
through.
the dance department are like, but they can do the splits, how does that dynamic work in an audition process, and where do you get to weigh in on that?
I mean, it's a constant give and take between the departments. And I mean, let's do an example of, on the Tina show, there was a Tina who was a categorical no for the dance department.
Right.
She was singing it better than anyone. And we had to plead, basically. And you have to, not plead, but you in the end, it worked. It's again, every situation is different, but hopefully you all have a decent relationship and you can all talk through. But there's so much give and take, and it's as we always say, it's a jigsaw puzzle which doesn't always necessarily fit together immediately, and it takes time to get to the finished product. But it's a skill that every department has to have, hasn't it? To be able to compromise.
Do you find that the music gets enough attention in that conflict process? Like,
probably everyone says the same thing. Every department probably says, well, we're not being listened to. but it does seem to be often that those voices can be then discarded because they didn't get through the dance. But again, it's often because a show is already set and you can't make any change. You can't make any compromise within the tracks that you are trying to cast.
Can I follow up that question? The same question, but in the rehearsal room. How do you deal with conflict between yourself and the director or yourself and the choreographer? What do you do to talk those sorts of things?
We will, if there could be a sensitive situation where it needs to be happening without the company there. But yeah, we should be able to work things through. Like the example I gave, I keep saying, I know we've got some choreographers here, by the way, so I keep mentioning dance departments, but it is music and dance. Let's be honest, it's usually the battleground, because we're expected to sing top C's whilst pirouetting around. It's just not going to work. So we need to work on compromises. So yes, we talk these things through calmly and with good humor.
Blame it on the drama schools for not turning out triple threats, I say.
Yeah. As long as the things are said, we'll be fine.
Thank you.
I had a question, if that's okay. I was wondering if you had any advice on orchestral conducting at all. So a little bit outside of like MD work, but say if you're working with like a string orchestra or a larger ensemble with like, I conducted our university's symphony orchestra a couple of weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I found I was really overwhelmed with the amount of players I had, and I was wondering if you had any advice for like a really large ensemble.
Well, yes, you don't know what it feels like till you do it. Do you? That's the thing. And I think the most important thing is you need to know what you want to get out of what is in front of you. You need to know what's on the page there, how you want that to sound. And I think that can be the same for anyone, depending on no matter their conducting experience or technique. if you are a musician enough and to be able to communicate that to the players, you should be able to achieve that. It is an overwhelming, of course it's overwhelming when you've got that many people looking at you expecting to tell them what to do, but they want you to do that because they know that they're not making the decision. They want you to make the decision. So clarity has to be paramount. And I'll go back to think of them as children. And that's you have to be that clear and concise with your direction that there won't be any arguments. But it is terrifying. Of course it is. I'm not suggesting it's not. And also, how late were the brass behind everyone else? And the strings, they like to go racing ahead when they got brass notes. And then they're all slow when they've got the long notes.
My seconds are always like 2 beats ahead of my first every time.
Yeah. But yeah, it's what a joy to be able to do it though, right?
Yeah, I only started conducting in September and I really love it, but I found I get very nervous when conducting a rehearsal, as Josh can attest to. So it's just kind of getting over that, and like even if you like know the music really well, it's then trying to not panic is something I really struggle with.
Sure. Have you ever tried maybe getting a computer monitor with a picture of an orchestra? Okay, I don't know, something like that, and then just practicing it and looking straight at them. It's a just feel those eyes on you, get used to it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I should try that before audition panels.
Well, there's that thing, isn't there? It's like, do you look above the head? I can't remember what they.
Oh, don't talk. But we covered this in the
the
directing one where I was like, casting directors, some want an eyeball, someone are like, why are you looking at me? Look up
sing
there.
it to me. Sing it to me. No, I don't want to sing it to you. And then when someone does sing it to you and you're on the panel, then you're going, oh, this was a bit weird. It's different every time. But I often, if I'm conducting people I don't necessarily know very well, I might just be above their eye line slightly, not looking in their eyes. It depends if they're receptive to, you can feel it when you're there. But yeah, it's a luxury to be able to do it, but keep at it.
Awesome.
Hello.
Somebody just woke up, sorry.
I just had a question, just not necessarily related to doing the role. Who's your favorite person that you've been able to work with so far? Kind
of favorite person, as in a performer, or
I guess going down the kind of performer routes, or other people you'd always want. I guess, or other people you'd always you've wanted to work with as well in future.
Well, I do. He's intensely frustrating, and he's too good, but he's also a complicated character. But I've worked with Jason Robert Brown quite a lot, and we sort of met as friends first of all, before we worked together. And he's very nice in that he trusts me musically in this country. But he's also he stamps his feet when he's playing, and also when he's not playing, but not in time. So we did this. There was a concert we did at the Royal Festival Hall, which was a bit seat of the pants, because he decided on the night who was conducting which number and who was playing. So I kind of didn't know what was going to happen next. And so suddenly he said, I'm going to play this one, you conduct it. And then he'd count it in just as I was about to count it in. But, we get on great. And I think as a writer, now that Leonard Bernstein's not around, to be able to work with Jason has been hugely inspiring and rewarding.
Amazing.
But he doesn't mind me saying that. We can say that.
I find it really interesting hearing all kind of the inside stories and the backstories of all these people that we only ever look at as a name and kind of put up on this pedestal, and finding out they're just human at the end of the day.
Yeah, he's a terrible conductor. I can say that much. But he loves to conduct. It's awful. And don't get me started on directing his own shows. Anyway, he doesn't trust directors. But hey, we all have our things.
We do.
Voice-wise, though, now interesting. There was a crossover because the first time I worked with her, we did Jason's show last 5 years. But Samantha Barks is someone who I have discovered to be the most consistent, and when you perhaps think of someone's going to be a diva, someone's going to be hard work, she is not. And she surprised me hugely just because I came with preconceptions. But she is so consistent and easy. Well, everything's easy for her anyway, so it's quite annoying. I didn't give her any notes either. So, Sam Barks, as far as has made a big impression in the sense of just being consistent and doing the job, So I can say that much, yeah. What's that now?
Sorry, that was number two. Number two. Joe asked, what's the most difficult note you've ever had to give?
Oh, well, difficult note. I don't know that it's difficult note. It's just I made a mess of saying it and I upset someone. I was doing a show. I won't mention what it was, but for the first time in a long time, it was with potentially some more mature performers who have been long-time pros. And one of them is well known for not singing in tune a lot of the time, but a fabulous actress and can get, tells the story beautifully. But the problem was that this particular show meant some quite close harmony work. And after about 2 weeks of rehearsal, I wasn't sleeping because I was concerned about this. And I decided during a sleepless night that I was going to shift her part. I was going to swap her with someone else. And I went to the other person first because I knew her. I'd known her for longer. And I said, how would you feel about swapping? She went, yeah, no, fine, yeah. And I found myself saying, because I'm finding that such and such is having a bit of trouble. And that's when I was starting to think, wait a minute, I've got to be careful here. And then I wasn't as careful as I could have been. So when I did suggest to the particular person that I wanted to move onto another part, she took it to mean that she couldn't do it, which wasn't the case. It was just, I think her vocally, she was going to suit doing a lower part. So there were tears, there were other things, and it took a couple of days of her not speaking to me, and then I gave a big apology, and I had to speak to the rest of the company as well. So those things can happen quite easily. But then again, I can be quite I have to be careful sometimes what I say, because I sometimes don't have the filter that I potentially should have, but that's because I'm a rounded human being and not just a robot music director.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
with that kind of thing, is that something you would try to pick up in the audition process? Like, would you try and do lots of ensemble work? Because obviously often it's a lot of solo work in that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, difficult to do ensemble work in auditions, of course. But I've just been doing some auditions for the Tina show, actually, and because the Ikettes, the Tina's backup singers, have to do a lot of close work. We do actually run through things in the auditions to be able to check that people can handle such work, whereas often you don't get to do that in auditions, and you kind of find out in rehearsals. But hopefully everyone's been trained beautifully and that they can do that, and that's why they're in the industry.
Hopefully.
Yes.
Do you ever find like a big shock then? How often does that happen, that you audition someone that you think is going to nail it and they actually are finding it difficult, as opposed to, are there also people that you audition where you're just like, oh, I'm not sure about this one, and then they end up just acing it?
You do have the luxury of having mobile phones now and knowing other people, where you can send messages in the audition room and say, you've worked with so and so, can you tell me how they were with,
right,
Yeah. Sometimes they don't answer in time though, and then then you find out in rehearsals, and yeah, it can be tricky, and yes, tracks may have to change because of that. And it does happen, not too often, but yeah, it has happened.
I had a quick question actually as well. So I kind of come from like the conducting side of things, and like the way, and it's kind of a question on how to improve on like general MDing and stuff. So the way like we do a lot of stuff is like observing the conductors and kind of sitting in on rehearsals, obviously, as well as going to the concerts. But what do you think is the best way these days to really like improve as an MD kind of from other people?
Well, just on my side of things, obviously I was a piano player and I wasn't a conductor necessarily, but I found myself, well, when I went to the academy, I did have some second study conducting lessons, but I didn't really, I have to say I had a bit of a problem with the teacher. I didn't really feel like that teacher was, for some reason, there was no connection. But I found myself when I was conducting that I remembered I kind of modeled myself on a teacher at school who used to run the concert band. He was actually a brass teacher, but he also conducted the concert band. And I think even to this day, I sort of still think of how he did things. That's me on conducting. So if you're coming from conducting to be able to get to improve on, listen to music more than anything, and have a knowledge, and not just of music, because we have to be able to explain things sometimes in a wider sense when you're dealing with people who are not necessarily musicians, and you've got to be able to translate what you want to get musically, potentially with a wider sort of view. So again, I had a composer mentor who said, there's no point in just being a musician. You have to be a man, a musician, and a universalist. He was quite a grand romantic figure, but, you know, I think it's true. You have to be able to have all these, you don't have to be a man, by the way. You can be a woman as well, or yes. So, but that's what he was saying to me. I think it's important to, observe, of course it is, but do it. You have to do it, and check in with people while you've got the chance to do that. If it's in, you know, with RicNic, you're all learning, I think, right? So you can, I mean, I think I'm always learning as well. So check in with people and find out how you're doing. Ask them if there's more that you can do, and I'll do that with on shows these days. I'll check, you know, are you getting enough from me? Are you getting, whether it's conducting, whether it's notes, you know, you can feel it after a while as well. You know, people are looking at you expecting something, or if they're thinking, why are you saying this again? You know, we learn how to keep going with those sort of things. But yeah, check in with people and find out. But yes, listen to lots of different music and read books and films and play games, everything. I don't think there's anything set, cut and dried to be an MD.
Thank you.
Sure.
Are there any further questions to ask tonight? Cool. I think we'll leave it on that note then. To be an MD, do everything, learn everything. It's probably a good summary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to not just be an MD. Musically speaking, do other things, and the same as, if you're in an orchestra for a show that's been going 20 years, when I look at the people in Lion King, I hope they're doing other things. Some aren't, and you can tell which ones aren't, but you need to keep yourself excited about music, which can not happen if you are doing the same thing all the time. But it is a trap. It's a trap that can be easily fallen into. Let's not end on a negative.
The trap of a secure wage.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and of course that's important. And theatre has become, for musicians, a more secure job than it used to be. There were much more options for musicians, but now shows have become one of the bigger job security areas.
I just have one final fun question. If you weren't an MD, what would you have been?
Does that mean I can't be in music?
No.
No, it doesn't mean I can't be in music, or I can.
No, it doesn't mean that. If you weren't an MD, with your skill set, interests, if you hadn't gone down this path, where do you think you might?
Oh, right. Well, I mean, it's the other side of my work, which is composing, and particularly for media, for film, TV, etc., is my other thing. And but then again, I like doing the thing that I'm not doing at the time. If I'm learning something, a classical piece, I want to be doing a piece of EDM. I want to be doing something else. My mind's always going on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So yes, I don't think there's one specific thing. Did think I wanted to open a tea shop in France. It's like a cafe during the day, and then I do like cooking, and then it's a restaurant at night, but only for the people that I like. And we maybe do a little bit of music now and again, but it's only the nice people that I like.
Sounds glorious.
Yes, and we have nice food and nice wine.
Wonderful.
Potentially in France.
I mean, you're still young, Torquil, this time.
Yes. Thank you.
On a personal note, I just really want to thank you for agreeing to do this. It's really been an impressive and insightful conversation. So, merci.
Sure. I hope I've made a little bit of sense.
Oh, absolutely.
That's been fab. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Pleasure. And the thing, if anyone is in the London area, I don't know where we all are, but if you have interest in coming in to sit in and visit on shows, I'm always up for doing things like that, because I play on a lot of shows as well, so we can sit and we can see how it is in the pit and things like that. So if anyone wants to get in touch, don't all rush at the same time, but perhaps Hannah or Josh could filter such requests. But,
absolutely, that's very, very generous. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. I know what an impact that had kind of when I was getting started, so to pass that on was brilliant. But yeah,
right.
Thank you so much for this. This has been really good. I'll get the recording out to those of you who are here. If there's any bits you want to go over again, along with a few of the resources, that'll go out on Monday. But otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you so much. It's been really insightful. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I'll sign off. I'm going to sign off.
Night, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Night. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.